The wind carried a strange stillness that afternoon. The sun, once golden and warm, had vanished behind clouds, and with it, all sense of peace. Deep in the heart of the forest, where branches tangled like secrets and shadows swallowed the path, Tyu Han was nowhere to be found. Tyu, Circa's legs trembled as she stepped over broken branches and torn pieces of her daughter's favorite red ribbon, lying on the dirt like a cry for help. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. Her breaths came in shallow gasps. Behind her, Han walked silently, but the fire in his eyes gave away the storm in his soul. His suit was stained with sweat and dirt. None of that mattered. Not when their child might be in danger. A trace of hope. For hours, they had searched through villages, along riverbanks, into abandoned sheds and hidden paths. Every second that passed twisted their fear into something unbearable. Then, a faint sound, a sob. Tyu froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Han nodded. They followed the sounds, lowly, carefully. Hearts in their throats, until they reached a crumbling wooden shack, half covered by overgrown vines. The door creaked open, and there, in the farthest corner, curled up on the cold floor, was Tieu Han. Her face was pale. Her hands shook. Her eyes wide, filled with terror met her mother's. "Mommy," she cried out. A moment that broke them. Tieu Han stumbled to her feet and ran, barefoot and sobbing, into Tyu Circa's arms. "My baby," Tyu whispered, falling to her knees, wrapping her daughter in every ounce of love and warmth she had left. "I'm here. I'm here now." She held her tightly, rocking her back and forth like she did when Han was still small enough to cradle to sleep. Han stood a few steps away, fists clenched, watching them. But the moment Tieu Han looked at him with tearful eyes, bruises on her knees, and a tremble in her voice, and whispered, "Daddy," something shattered inside him. He knelt, placed his hand gently on her back, and whispered, "You're safe now, I swear." And for the first time that day, the wind felt warm again. The ride back home. Wrapped in a blanket, with Tyu holding her close in the back seat, Tieu Han finally fell asleep, though her breaths were still uneven, her hands still curled in fists. She had been through something no child should face. Han didn't speak much on the ride. His mind swirled with rage toward whoever dared to hurt their little girl. But stronger than that was the pain of knowing she had cried and he hadn't been there. He made a silent vow, never again. That night, they laid Tieu Han between them on the bed, unwilling to leave her side even for a second. Han stayed awake most of the night, his eyes fixed on her peaceful face. "She's so small," he said softly. Tyu nodded, brushing hair from their daughter's forehead. "But she's stronger than we think." Han reached out and took her hand. "So are you." A promise for the future. In the days that followed, Tieu Han began to smile again. The color returned to her cheeks. The nightmares faded. But for Han and Tyu, something had changed forever. It wasn't just about protecting their daughter from the world anymore. It was about building a world where she never had to feel alone, where love surrounded her like armor, where fear had no place. The house was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that lingers after a storm. That night, every creak in the wooden floor made Tyu flinch. Every shadow felt too long. Every sudden gust of wind outside made her heart skip. But she didn't sleep. She couldn't, not with Tieu Han curled beside her, her little hands gripping her mother's sleeve, even in dreams. Han sat across the room, still in his dirt-stained clothes, elbows on his knees, head down. He hadn't said much since they returned. Not because he was distant, but because he was devastated. He had promised to protect his family. And still, somehow, someone had gotten close enough to hurt what mattered most. A whisper in the dark. Sometime after midnight, Tyu Han stirred. Her voice was weak. "Mommy, I'm here, baby." Lai Tuha sat up immediately, brushing her daughter's hair. Tyu Han opened her eyes slowly. "Is he gone?" Hung's eyes lifted. He moved closer. "No one will ever hurt you again," Lai, Tayuka whispered. But Han wasn't fully convinced. Her lips trembled. "He told me you didn't love me anymore." Lai Tayuka gasped softly. "Who told you that?" Tayuka's voice cracked. "The man with the scar. He said you gave me away." Hung stood, fists clenched. "He's lying. He's a coward who preys on fear. You are our daughter. You are everything to us." "But I was so scared," she whimpered. Hung walked over and knelt beside the bed. "Me too," he said honestly. "But I never stopped looking, and I never will." Then slowly, gently, Tyu Han reached out her arms to him. He pulled her into his chest, holding her close, holding all her fear and all his guilt with a strength only a father could offer. In the days that followed, recovery was slow. Tyu Han would flinch at loud noises. She didn't want to go outside. She clung to Lai Tuha constantly, and only allowed Hung out of her sight if she could still hear his voice. So, he began to talk more. He told her stories, read her bedtime books, carved her little wooden animals from leftover pine. He even let her sleep with one of his jackets, because she said it smelled like safety. And Twuk, she became even gentler, even more present. She sang lullabies again, held her longer, cried when no one was watching. Together, they created a bubble of healing, no matter how fragile. One morning, a week after the incident, Hung was sitting on the porch when he felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. Tyu Han stood beside him, wearing her pink dress and holding her carved wooden deer. "Daddy," she said softly, "can we go for a walk, just me and you?" He blinked, stunned. Of course. Lai Tayuka stepped out, surprised. But when their eyes met, she smiled. A silent nod passed between them. The walk. Hung and Tyu Han walked slowly down the gravel path. The sun was gentle. The leaves danced in the breeze. For a long time, neither said a word. Then Tyu Han looked up and asked, "You're not mad at me, right? Why would I ever be mad at you?" She shrugged, "Because I got lost." Back at the house, when they returned, Lai Tayuka was waiting with warm soup and open arms. For the first time in days, Tyu Han skipped toward her, laughed. That night, as the stars blinked above, they sat together, mother, father, daughter, on the porch, wrapped in one big blanket. And for the first time since that horrible day, it felt like home again. In a world that often moves too fast and forgets too easily, stories like Tyu Han's remind us of something sacred, the quiet, powerful truth that real healing begins with love that refuses to leave. Tyu Han was just a child, but her fear was very real. She was taken from safety, lied to by someone cruel, and left in a place where shadows were louder than hope. What broke her heart was not just the fear of being hurt, but the terrifying belief that maybe her parents no longer loved her. And that's the kind of pain no child should ever feel. But what saved her wasn't only the search. It wasn't only the rescue. What saved her was the moment her mother wrapped her arms around her, and her father whispered, we never stopped looking. That moment, that warmth, that truth, that presence planted the seed of healing. This story teaches us that children don't need perfect parents. They need present ones. They need to be seen, held, reassured again and again, until their fear fades and their smiles return. And it's not just children. Adults, too, carry wounds from abandonment, rejection, or past trauma. And often, what we all long for deep down is someone who won't walk away when things get hard. Someone who stays when we fall apart. Someone who says, "You are not broken beyond repair. I still see you. I still choose you." Love is not only a feeling, it's a choice we make, especially when it's hardest. So whether you are the one healing, or the one holding someone else together, know this. The most powerful thing you can give is not advice, not answers, not control, but your quiet, steady, unshakable presence. Because love that stays healed. There are moments in life when fear takes over, when someone we love disappears, when darkness replaces hope, and when we feel helpless watching someone we cherish fall apart. That's what Tieu Han faced when their daughter, Tieu Han, was taken from them. But what followed was not just a rescue, it was a reminder of what love truly means. Sometimes, children don't need long explanations or promises. They just need to be held, to be heard, to be reminded that love hasn't left them. And in that way, love becomes more than emotion, it becomes a shelter. This story is a reminder to all of us. Whether we are parents, siblings, friends, or partners, our greatest power is not in what we say, but in how present we are when someone needs us most. Because in a world that can be frightening and uncertain, the safest place will always be the one where love stays, listens, and holds on.